Why does the empath quietly cut everyone off and never look back? You see a retreat, you see bitterness, and you assume it's a sign they've finally collapsed under the weight of the world. But you are misreading the evidence. They didn't break down, they broke free. Carl Jung saw a deeper truth. When the psyche is pushed beyond its limit, it does not beg, it reorganizes. The empath hasn't run away to hide, they have withdrawn to survive. Something deep within them recognized a pattern it could no longer sustain inside of and quietly shut the door. This isn't avoidance. It is a psychological crossing point. The version of the empath you once had access to, the one who tolerated everything, has quietly exited the room for good. In this video, we uncover why the empath's quiet exit is not a sign of defeat, but the most resolute act of a soul that has finally decided to belong only to itself. To understand why the empath leaves, we must first dismantle a myth. There is a pervasive belief that this deep sensitivity is purely a spiritual gift, or a sign of superior moral character. But that is a dangerous half-truth. While the capacity to feel is certainly a trait of the soul, the compulsion to feel for others is not. The inability to shut it off is not a mystical virtue. It is a scar. It is a mark the body remembers. For the person who eventually cuts everyone off, this empathy did not begin as a conscious choice to be kind. It began as a necessity. It was a survival mechanism, developed in response to an environment that was never safe. But here's the part most people never notice. The empath didn't choose to become this way. They were wired to be this way before they could even speak. This pattern doesn't start in adulthood. It forms much earlier, within the architecture of the developing psyche Carl Jung described. In early childhood, there is no clear boundary between the child and the emotional world around them. Jung called this state participation mystique. The child does not yet have a separate ego. Their psyche is fused with the psychic atmosphere of the home. In a healthy environment, the child gradually differentiates themselves. But in an environment where the emotional climate is volatile, where the parents are emotionally immature, or where love is conditional upon performance, this differentiation is arrested.
The child learns that to be separate is to be in danger.
In such a home, the child develops a state of hypervigilance. It happens long before choice is possible, wired directly into the nervous system. They learn to read the unspoken tensions in a room before a word is uttered. They become experts in micro-expressions, tone of voice, and the heavy silence that precedes an outburst. They learn to anticipate the needs of the parent to prevent conflict or to secure a scrap of safety. If the father walks in with a heavy step, the child instantly calibrates their own behavior to neutralize the threat. If the mother is depressive, the child becomes the cheerleader or the counselor to stabilize the mother, because the child intuitively knows that they cannot survive if the caregiver collapses. There's a dinner table in a household like this. To the outside observer, it looks like a normal family meal. But inside the empath child, a high-stakes intelligence operation is running. They are monitoring the breathing patterns of the adults. They are watching the way a fork is set down. They are suppressing their own hunger, their own stories, and their own needs because they sense that the air in the room is too thin to support more than one ego, and that ego belongs to the parent. They learn to exist in the margins. That sensitivity becomes a kind of radar. The empath wires themselves to scan for external threats in the form of emotional shifts. This is the origin of the gift of empathy. It is the ability to feel the other person's state so accurately that you can manage it for them. But here's what it actually is. It is not altruism. It is a defense strategy. The empath learns that their safety depends entirely on their ability to regulate the emotions of the people around them. If they can keep the environment calm, they are safe. If they can make the other person happy, they are secure. Over time, this adaptation calcifies into a personality structure. The individual reaches adulthood believing they are naturally a listener, a healer, or a peacemaker. They enter relationships and friendships assuming this role, but in reality, they are simply stuck in a chronic stress response. They are constantly managing the emotional economy of their social circle because their unconscious mind still believes that safety is something that must be earned through utility. Jung argued that the neurosis of the adult is often the continued application of a childhood survival strategy that is no longer necessary. The empath is applying the logic of the unsafe home to the entire world. They are walking through life with their sensors turned up to maximum capacity, picking up on every frequency of pain, need, and anger in their vicinity. This requires a tremendous amount of psychic energy, or libido. A mechanism designed for short-term crises in childhood is unsustainable as a long-term lifestyle. The nervous system eventually accumulates a debt. The empath who cuts everyone off is often just a person whose biological resources have been depleted by decades of hypervigilance. They do not leave because they want to hurt anyone. They leave because the mechanism of survival has shifted. The danger is no longer the anger of others. The danger is the total exhaustion of the self. The unconscious mind realizes that the radar system is consuming so much power that the ship is sinking. This realization is the first step in a profound psychological unraveling. It forces the individual to question everything they thought they were. If their kindness was actually fear, and their listening was actually a defense strategy, then who are they really? This question begins the journey of individuation, but it also initiates a necessary, brutal isolation. If you are ready to stop mistaking survival for identity, subscribe to Zero Mind. This is a space for those reclaiming authorship over their inner life. In the next part, we'll see how this way of surviving quietly reshaped the empath's idea of love, until losing themselves felt normal, even necessary. The tragedy of the empath's history is deeply rooted in a linguistic and conceptual error. What they identified as love for most of their lives was, in structural reality, a form of functional self-erasure. They were conditioned to believe that intimacy was synonymous with the suppression of the authentic self in favor of a compliant, accommodating persona. They did not just learn to serve, they learned to disappear, and they called this disappearance connection. There is a version of you built to function in the world, to be acceptable, useful, and easy to be around. Jung referred to this social mask as the persona. It is a necessary tool for social interaction. We all wear one to some degree. However, for the empath, the persona became the entire house, rather than just the front door. This persona was constructed around the archetype of the giver, the understander, or the saint. This mask was highly effective in the social marketplace. It garnered praise. It secured friendships. It made them the favorite employee or the low-maintenance partner. But it came with a hidden, devastating clause. The empath was only valuable as long as they were mirroring the needs of others. The relationships formed under this persona were not mutual exchanges. They were transactions of emotional labor. The empath would provide stability, listening, validation, and regulation. In exchange, they would receive a temporary sense of belonging or safety. But this belonging was conditional on their silence. They conditioned the people around them to expect a version of them that had no needs, no boundaries, no anger, and no preferences. They trained their friends and family to treat them as a utility rather than a person. A quieter question starts to surface. When was the last time the empath felt safe enough to put their burden down? Or have they simply become a dumpster for everyone else's emotions? This is what friendship often looks like for this kind of empath. You have a friend who calls you only when they are in crisis. They talk for 45 minutes about their job, their relationship, their anxiety. You listen, you affirm, you offer advice. Then, when the conversation turns to you, you feel a subtle shift in the energy. The friend becomes distracted, checks their phone, or suddenly has to go. The empath feels this shift immediately. And what do? They retreat. They stop talking about themselves to keep the connection alive. They learn that their role is to be the container for the other person's contents, not to have contents of their own. This dynamic creates a profound economic imbalance in the psyche. The empath suppresses their own shadow, the parts of themselves that are demanding, selfish, ambitious, or angry, because they believe these traits will lead to abandonment. They project all their value onto their ability to tolerate the intolerable. They believe that endurance is a measure of love. If they can endure a toxic partner, a demanding parent, or a parasitic friend, they prove their worthiness. They mistake the capacity to suffer for the capacity to love. It feels like love. But over time, something else quietly takes its place. It is a refusal to be a separate individual. Jung warned that when an individual identifies too closely with the persona, they lose contact with their own soul. The empath became a stranger to themselves because they spent all their energy curating an experience for everyone else. They existed in the third person, viewing their life through the eyes of those they were trying to please. They asked, "What do they need me to be?" instead of, "Who am I?" The cut-off often happens when the empath realizes the fraudulent nature of these connections. It usually occurs during a crisis in the empath's own life, a sickness, a job loss, or a period of depression. Suddenly, the giver has nothing left to give. And what happens? The phone stops ringing. The friends who took up hours of their time are suddenly too busy to help. The partner becomes irritable because the empath is no longer regulating their mood. The empath looks around and sees the truth. They are surrounded by people who do not know them. These people only know the service they provide. They realize that they are not loved for who they are. They are consumed for what they do. This realization is devastating. It feels like a death. But it is also the beginning of liberation. It shatters the illusion that self-erasure is a virtue. When they finally stop performing, the people around them often react with anger, shock, or accusation. The nice person is suddenly unavailable. The easy friend is suddenly difficult. But the empath is not acting out of malice. They are simply correcting a decades-long error. They are retrieving the parts of themselves they auctioned off for affection. They are learning that a relationship that requires you to disappear is not a relationship. It is a captivity. The silence that follows is the sound of the empath finally inhabiting their own center. They are no longer willing to buy love with the currency of their own soul. They are willing to risk being alone if it means they no longer have to be invisible. They realize that the loneliness of solitude is far bearable than the loneliness of being with people who only see a mask. I'm curious if this sounds familiar. Being understanding worked until it cost you your presence. If you recognize that moment, comment invisible. Many learn it quietly, without realizing it. In the next part, the question becomes unavoidable. How long can someone keep giving like this before something inside them finally breaks? Every empath who eventually walks away hits the same wall. It is an unavoidable breaking point, a line the psyche can no longer cross. This decision isn't made with a rational pros and cons list on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It isn't a calculation, it is a collapse. They reach a state of psychic saturation. At this stage, the option to keep giving isn't just difficult, it is structurally removed by the unconscious. The psyche does not tolerate permanent imbalance. When something is pushed too far, it corrects itself, and it does not ask for your permission. For the empath, the imbalance is fatal. It is a chronic, decades-long outflow of energy, with absolutely no return. They have spent years pouring their own life force into the voids of others, trying to fill bottomless pits of need, drama, and dysfunction. This leads to a state of existential depletion. It is not merely that they are tired in the way one is tired after a long day of work. It is that they are bankrupt. The internal resources required to process empathy, to listen, to care, and to regulate others have been completely exhausted. The breaking point is the moment the psyche declares insolvency. The bank is closed. Leading up to this rupture, the empath often experiences a rise in shadow content. Jung taught that the shadow contains everything the conscious ego rejects or represses. For the nice, accommodating empath, the shadow holds their aggression, their resentment, their selfishness, and their capacity for coldness. As the depletion worsens, these suppressed forces begin to leak through the cracks of the persona. The empath begins to feel flashes of intense, irrational anger toward people they claim to love. They feel a secret revulsion when someone asks for help. They feel a dark, heavy dread when their phone rings, a physical tightening in the chest that signals threat. They might find themselves fantasizing about moving to a cabin in the woods where no one can speak to them. Instead of listening to these signals, the empath initially tries to compensate by doing more. This is the tragic cycle. They double down on the persona. They think, I am feeling resentful, which means I am being a bad person, so I must give more to prove I am good. They give more, forgive more, and suppress more, thinking they can outwork the exhaustion. But this is like running on a broken leg to prove it isn't broken. It only accelerates the collapse. What's pushed to an extreme eventually flips into its opposite. Jung called this reversal enantiodromia. The extreme selflessness flips into extreme detachment. The unconscious withdraws energy from the social functions of the personality entirely. It does this to save the organism. The sudden coldness that others perceive is actually a protective mechanism. The psyche slams the door shut to prevent total ego death. It is a biological veto against the conscious mind's willingness to destroy itself for others. The empath finds they physically cannot bring themselves to care about one more crisis that is not their own. They cannot listen to one more complaint. They cannot offer one more word of reassurance. It feels like a physical revulsion, akin to trying to eat when you are already vomiting. This is what that moment actually feels like. The empath wakes up one morning and the anxiety about pleasing others is simply gone, replaced by a flat, impenetrable numbness. A friend calls with an emergency, the same emergency they have had for 5 years, and instead of rushing to help, the empath feels nothing. They stare at the phone and put it face down. They do not feel guilt, they feel a strange, empty clarity. This isn't a failure of character. It's the system protecting itself. The empath is forced to retreat because they have become saturated with the psychic material of others. They are like a sponge that has soaked up so much dirty water that it cannot take in a single drop more. They need to undergo a period of decontamination. They need to be alone to distinguish their own emotions from the emotions they have absorbed from the collective. The breaking point transforms the empath's functioning. They move from a mode of limitless availability to a mode of strict, ruthless conservation. They are no longer operating on surplus, they are operating on critical reserves. The decision to cut people off is not an intellectual choice, it is a survival reflex. It is the only way to stop the hemorrhaging of the self. And once the psyche reaches this point, it does not negotiate a return. It enforces a permanent shutdown. In the next part, we'll move closer to the silence itself, and why, at this stage, explaining becomes impossible. When the collapse finally happens, the most striking feature of the event is the lack of noise. The empath does not usually engage in a screaming match, a dramatic final confrontation, or a list of demands. They do not issue ultimatums. They simply vanish. They stop answering texts. They stop showing up to events. They become a ghost in their own life. This silence is often misinterpreted by the outside world as passive aggression, arrogance, or cowardice. But at its core, it's the moment the persona simply stops working. The persona is the interface the ego uses to negotiate with the world. It is the social skin we wear to interact with others. For the empath, the persona was constructed around specific archetypes: the listener, the fixer, the peacemaker, or the rock. Maintaining this mask requires a continuous, massive investment of psychic energy. It takes effort to suppress one's own truth to validate someone else's. It takes active work to soften one's tone, to nod politely when one wants to walk away, and to offer explanations that smooth over conflict. For years, the empath funded this persona with their own vitality. But when the psychic energy runs out, the persona disintegrates. The empath literally loses the ability to perform the role. They stop explaining because explaining is a function of the persona. To explain is to ask for understanding. It is a plea for the other person to validate one's decision. It is an act of bridging the gap between two people to maintain the connection. The empath who has reached the end of their capacity no longer has the energy to build that bridge. They have entered a state of energy conservation so severe that speech itself feels like an unaffordable luxury. Every word spoken in justification feels like a loss of essential resources. The empath realizes that they do not have enough energy to save themselves, and explaining the rescue mission to the people watching from the shore is impossible. Carl Jung noted that when the libido, the psychic energy, withdraws from the object, the external world, it returns to the subject, the self. The empath withdraws all their energy from external relationships and pulls it into the center of the self to prevent a total psychological collapse. This withdrawal effectively cuts the power cord to the social mask. The nice person dies because the energy required to keep them animated is no longer available. The silence is the most efficient way to handle the separation. Engaging in a closure conversation requires the empath to process the other person's emotions one last time. It requires them to absorb the other person's anger, their confusion, their guilt, or their attempt to manipulate the situation. The saturated psyche cannot handle this. It cannot process one more byte of emotional data. So it installs a firewall. It often shows up like this. An empath receives a long emotional text message from a friend they are trying to distance themselves from. The friend is demanding answers, asking, "What did I do?" or Why are you acting like this? In the past, the empath would have felt a surge of guilt and immediately typed a long, careful response to reassure the friend. Now the empath looks at the screen and feels a flat, heavy exhaustion. They physically cannot type the response. It is not that they are choosing to be cruel. It is that the part of their brain that used to manage the friend's emotions has shut down. They delete the text and put the phone away. This is often labeled as ghosting, a term that carries a stigma of immaturity. However, in this specific context, ghosting is an act of integrity. The empath is refusing to participate in a conversation that they know is futile. They know that if they open the door even a crack, if they send one text explaining why they are taking space, the other person will push the door open and flood them with demands. The explanation will lead to an argument. The argument will lead to the empath apologizing. The apology will lead to them getting sucked back in. The silence is the only tool that prevents this cycle from restarting. The people left behind often demand answers because they feel entitled to access. They believe that their history with the empath grants them the right to a hearing. They ask, why? But the empath knows that the why is too complex to be understood by those who benefited from the status quo. To explain the departure would be to re-enter the dynamic that caused the depletion. The empath realizes that they do not owe an explanation for their own survival. You do not apologize for swimming to the surface when you are drowning, and you do not explain your need for air to the water that is choking you. This leads to the realization that closure is often a trap. The request for closure is frequently a disguised attempt by the other person to extract one last feed of energy or to regain control of the narrative. The empath understands that true closure is an internal act. It does not require the other person's participation or agreement. By refusing to engage in the closure ritual, the empath is breaking the contract of codependency. They are stating, through their silence, that they no longer require the other person's permission to change their life. When the persona collapses, something more real finally has room to form. The empath is shedding a skin that has become too tight. The silence is the space where the new skin hardens. It is a protective barrier. If the empath were to speak, they would likely express rage or raw truth that would cause permanent damage. The silence is actually a mercy. It saves the other person from hearing the full extent of the empath's accumulated resentment. The withdrawal is the first time the empath prioritizes their own reality over the collective harmony. It is the death of the good soldier archetype who marches on despite the pain. They stop fighting wars that are not theirs. They stop maintaining bridges that only bring invasion. The silence is the boundary that the persona was never strong enough to set. It is the ultimate no, spoken without a single word, establishing a border that can no longer be crossed. In the next part, something subtle but decisive shifts, where hope quietly loses its grip and something firmer takes its place. For years, the empath remained in draining one-sided connections because they were sustained by a specific dangerous fuel: hope. This hope was not an optimistic outlook on life. It was a psychological trap. They lived in the future tense, constantly interacting with the potential of others rather than their reality. They looked at a narcissistic partner, a selfish friend, or a chaotic family member, and they did not see the person standing in front of them. They saw a vision of who that person could become if they were loved enough, supported enough, or understood enough. Hope becomes a way to avoid the pain of the present. It allows the empath to avoid the grief of admitting that their needs are not being met and likely never will be. They bargain with reality. They trade their current suffering for a hypothetical future payoff. They operate on a hidden contract that says, if I endure this mistreatment now, I will be rewarded with the relationship I want later. This keeps them locked in a cycle of waiting. They are gambling their life energy on a jackpot that never comes. The quiet departure occurs when the empath replaces hope with reality. Something shifts here, not dramatically but decisively. It is the moment the reality function, as Jung might term it, overrides the sentimental fantasies of the ego. The ego loves to believe it has the power to change others. It clings to the idea that its love is a transformative force. But the reality function looks at the data without emotion. It looks at the history of the relationship without the filter of excuse-making. When this shift happens, the empath stops looking at what people could be and starts looking at what they are. They look at the evidence. They see the patterns of exploitation. They see the lack of reciprocity. They see the chronic misunderstanding. And for the first time, they stop viewing these things as temporary glitches or wounds that can be healed. They see them as the fundamental structure of the relationship. They realize that the other person is not treating them this way because they are confused or wounded. They are treating them this way because this is their character. This realization destroys the foundation of the empath's patience. In the past, they interpreted the other person's bad behavior as a cry for help. This interpretation allowed them to stay in the role of the helper. But now, they interpret the behavior as a choice. They understand that the person they are trying to save has no interest in being saved. They realize that the chaos is not something happening to the other person. It is something the other person is actively creating. When hope dies, boundaries emerge. A boundary in this context is simply the recognition of facts. It is the acknowledgement that this person is incapable of hearing me, or this dynamic is built on my submission. Once this reality is accepted, the empath no longer feels the need to change the other person. They realize that trying to change someone else is a form of aggression and a waste of energy. It is an attempt to force reality to fit a fantasy. This transition marks the end of the savior complex. Jung suggested that the desire to save others is often a projection of the need to save oneself. The empath projects their own desire for healing onto the broken people around them. They try to fix the outside world to avoid facing the brokenness in their own boundaries. By cutting everyone off, the empath withdraws this projection. They accept that they cannot save others from their own karma, their own choices, or their own limitations. They resign from the impossible job of managing other people's destinies. This clarity removes the guilt that usually keeps the empath trapped. In the past, they felt guilty for leaving because they felt they were abandoning a project that wasn't finished. They felt they were failing the potential of the relationship. Now, they realize the project was doomed from the start because the other person was never a willing participant. They understand that saying no is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of accuracy. They are aligning their external behavior with their internal truth. The empath chooses the pain of truth over the comfort of illusion. They accept that they may be judged, disliked, or blamed, but they prefer this hostility to the falseness of the previous dynamic. They trade the possibility of connection for the certainty of self-respect. This is often the hardest step because it involves the sunk cost fallacy. The empath has invested years of time, emotion, and effort into these relationships. Walking away means admitting that this investment is gone and cannot be recovered. It means declaring emotional bankruptcy on a specific relationship to save the rest of their assets. It usually shows up the moment an empath stops making excuses for a parent or a partner. For years, every time the parent was critical, the empath would say, "They don't mean it. They had a hard childhood." One day, the empath hears the criticism and simply thinks, "This is hurtful, and I do not want to hear it." The excuse dissolves. The history of the parent no longer justifies the abuse of the present. The empath realizes that understanding why someone is toxic does not make them less toxic. The boundary is not a wall built to punish the other. It is a definition of where the empath ends and the other begins. It is the end of the enmeshment. The empath realizes that they have been waiting for a train at an airport. No matter how long they wait, no matter how good of a person they are, the train is not coming because the tracks do not go there. So they walk away. This walking away is the ultimate assertion of the self. Jung taught that the process of individuation requires the individual to differentiate themselves from the collective. By refusing to participate in the shared delusion of the relationship, the empath creates a distinct identity. They become the person who sees the elephant in the room and refuses to pretend it is not there. This makes them dangerous to the stability of the dysfunction, which is why the cutoff must be total. They cannot half participate in a lie. The death of hope is not a cynical event. It is a maturing event. It is the moment the empath grows up. They stop demanding that the world be different than it is. They stop demanding that people be better than they are capable of being. They accept reality. And in that acceptance, they find the freedom to place themselves in a different reality. They stop trying to grow flowers in concrete and decide to move to a garden where the soil is actually fertile. When the empath replaces hope with boundaries, they become unreachable to manipulation. Manipulation relies on the target's hope that compliance will lead to a reward. When the target no longer wants the reward because they know it is fake, the manipulation has no lever to pull. The empath looks at the manipulator with a neutral gaze. They are not angry. They are simply finished. They have seen the end of the movie, and they are walking out of the theater before the credits roll. Hope kept the door cracked open. Boundaries are what seal it shut. In the next part, we confront a belief many people never question: the idea that healing means going back. There is a pervasive and damaging cultural narrative that suggests healing is synonymous with reconciliation. For the empath, returning is not healing, it is regression. We are conditioned by family values, religious doctrines, and even modern therapy to believe that the ultimate sign of spiritual growth is the ability to make nice with those who hurt us. The story goes that if you are truly healed, you should be able to sit at the table with the people who exploited you without being affected. We are told that forgiveness means reopening the door, and that keeping the door locked is a sign of lingering bitterness or unresolved trauma. The empath who cuts everyone off and never returns challenges this narrative at its core. They discover a harder, less comfortable truth. True psychological healing often requires permanent separation. This is not because they are holding a grudge, but because they have fundamentally altered the structure of their reality. The logic that suggests we must return to the scene of the crime to prove we have recovered is a fallacy. It is a trap designed to pull the individual back into the service of the collective. Becoming whole often means leaving the roles that once kept you safe. The empath cannot find their own center if they are constantly orbiting the gravity of others' needs and expectations. The relationships they leave behind are often artifacts of their unhealed self. They were formed when the empath was operating out of a deficit, seeking approval or safety through submission. To individuate means to stand alone, distinct from the family or social group that defined the person in childhood. This separation is not a temporary phase. It is often a permanent relocation of the psychic center. The pressure to return is often framed as a moral obligation. But the evolved empath realizes that returning to a toxic dynamic is not a moral act. It is an act of regression. Jung warned extensively against the danger of regressing into the unconscious comfort of the group. When we return to an environment where we were once submissive, small, or used, the psyche is under immense pressure to revert to those old patterns. The neural pathways of the helper or the scapegoat are still there, dormant but deep. Walking back into the old environment triggers these pathways. The empath finds that within minutes of being back in the old circle, they feel the urge to apologize, to fix, or to shrink. The decision to stay away is a protective measure against this regression. The empath recognizes that their new identity is still young. It is solidifying, but it is not yet invulnerable. To expose this new self to the old grinding mechanisms of the past is not bravery, it is recklessness. The people from the past hold a fixed, static image of who the empath used to be. They have a vested interest in the empath returning to that role because it served their ego. They do not want the new, sovereign version of the empath. They want the convenient version. The friction between who the empath has become and who the group wants them to be creates a dissonance that is simply not worth the energy to manage. This leads to a profound shift in how the empath views validation. In the past, the desire to return was often driven by a need to show the others that they had changed. There was a fantasy that if they went back now, strong and healthy, the others would finally respect them. They would finally see the empath's worth. But this desire is itself a symptom of the old wound. It implies that the empath's value is still dependent on the external recognition of the group. The moment the cutoff becomes permanent is the moment the empath realizes they no longer need the witnesses of their past to validate their present. The need to prove anything to anyone evaporates. Jung suggested that we project our own inner value onto others, believing they hold the keys to our worth. When the empath withdraws these projections, they take the keys back. They realize that the only validation that matters is the internal sense of congruence. If they feel whole when they are alone, that is enough. They do not need the applause of the people who used to boo them. Forgiveness and access are often confused, but they are not the same thing. They are frequently blended together, yet they serve very different purposes. Forgiveness is an internal release. It is the decision to stop carrying the poison of resentment in one's own body. It is the act of untying the energetic knot that binds the victim to the perpetrator. The empath can achieve this state completely in isolation. They can process their anger, understand the limitations of the other person, and release the desire for revenge without ever speaking to them again. Access, on the other hand, is a privilege. It is the ability to enter the empath's physical and emotional space. Forgiveness does not grant access. You can forgive a thief for stealing from you because you understand their desperation, but you do not give them the keys to your house again. The empath understands that the people they left have demonstrated a consistent inability to respect boundaries. This behavior is usually structural to their personality, not a temporary mistake. Therefore, the empath grants forgiveness from a distance, wishing them well while keeping the gate firmly locked. This distance protects the psyche from contamination. Just as a surgeon requires a sterile field to operate, the psyche requires a relatively clean environment to heal deep wounds. The old relationships are often filled with the bacteria of guilt, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. Every interaction with them introduces these toxins back into the empath's system, forcing the empath to waste energy fighting off the infection rather than growing. The permanent cutoff creates the necessary sterile field. It allows the empath to direct 100% of their energy toward expansion rather than defense. The empath realizes that the guilt they feel about not returning is not their own voice. It is the internalized voice of the collective they left behind. It is the voice of the parent who demanded loyalty over health. It is the voice of the friend who demanded availability over autonomy. By ignoring this guilt and refusing to return, the empath is breaking the final chain. They are proving to themselves that they are no longer ruled by the fear of disappointing others. The choice not to return is an act of integrity. It is an acknowledgement that the relationship has served its purpose and run its course. Trying to revive it would be an act of dishonesty, pretending that a connection exists where there is only history. The empath chooses the honesty of absence over the hypocrisy of presence. They accept that they are the villain in the other person's story, and they are okay with that, as long as they are the hero in their own. In the next part, we reach the point where the question of returning dissolves completely, because there is nothing left to return to. The final reason the empath never returns is perhaps the most difficult to accept, yet it is the most critical for their psychological liberation. It is the realization that the relationship they are mourning did not exist in the shared reality. It existed primarily in their own effort, their own projection, and their own tolerance. When the empath stops performing the specific functions of the giver or the listener, the relationship does not just pause, it collapses completely. This collapse reveals a disturbing truth. There is nothing substantial to go back to. For years, the empath likely believed they were in a mutual connection. They believed there was a bond between two people who cared for one another. However, the silence that follows their withdrawal proves otherwise. If a connection requires one person to do all the reaching out, all the planning, and all the emotional regulating, it is not a connection, it is a dependency. The empath realizes that the dynamic was sustained entirely by their own energy. The moment they withdraw that energy, the structure disintegrates because the other person was never actively holding up their side of the weight. This is where Carl Jung's concept of the persona becomes critical to understanding the permanent nature of the departure. The empath interacted with these people through a specific persona, a constructed role designed to be useful, accommodating, and low maintenance. The friends and family members formed a relationship with that persona, not with the true self of the empath. They bonded with the utility the empath provided. They loved the convenience. They loved the validation. They loved having a place to dump their anxieties. But they did not necessarily know or love the individual behind the function. When the empath undergoes the transformation of cutting everyone off, that persona dies. It is a psychological death. The nice, limitless version of them no longer exists. Therefore, returning is impossible because the entity that was in the relationship is gone. To go back would require the empath to resurrect a dead version of themselves. It would require them to suppress their new awareness and shrink back into a shape that they have outgrown. This is not just difficult, it is structurally impossible. The psyche, once expanded, cannot be forced back into its original, smaller dimensions without causing severe psychological damage. We see this mechanism clearly in the reactions of the people left behind. Often they do not reach out to ask how the empath is doing or to express genuine concern for their well-being. Instead, they reach out with demands or accusations. They ask why the empath is being difficult. They ask why the empath has changed. They are not missing the person, they are missing the service. They are like a customer complaining that a machine has stopped working. This reaction confirms the empath's assessment. The relationship was transactional. The grief the empath feels is real, but it is not for the loss of a genuine bond. It is the grief of realizing that the bond was never what they thought it was. Jung argued that true maturity involves the withdrawal of projections. For a long time, the empath projected qualities onto these people that were not there. They projected potential. They projected the idea that these friends were capable of reciprocity if given enough time. When the empath cuts ties, they withdraw these projections. They see the reality of the other person without the filter of hope. They see that the narcissist is just a narcissist, not a wounded soul needing love. They see that the taker is just a taker, not a friend in a temporary crisis. Once this reality is seen, it cannot be unseen. The illusion holds no more power. There is no magnetic pull to return because the empath understands that the intimacy they felt was actually just proximity and shared history. Without the empath's active effort to maintain the illusion, the other person becomes a stranger. The empath realizes they have nothing in common with these people other than a history of being used by them. This lack of common ground is absolute. Relationships require a shared level of consciousness, or at least a shared set of values to survive. The empath has moved to a new level of psychological operation, where truth, autonomy, and reciprocity are the baseline requirements. The people from the past are still operating on a baseline of manipulation, unconsciousness, and extraction. There is no bridge between these two realities. To return would be to voluntarily lower one's consciousness. It would be a betrayal of the self. The dynamic of the dyad, the pair, has broken. Jung observed that relationships often function on unconscious contracts. One person agrees to be the helpful one, and the other agrees to be the helpless one. This creates a stable, albeit dysfunctional system. When the empath resigns from the role of the helpful one, the contract is voided. The helpless one is forced to either grow up or find a new enabler. They usually choose the latter. By the time the empath even considers looking back, the other person has likely already replaced them. This confirms that the empath was fungible, replaceable in the eyes of the other. This final confirmation seals the door shut. The empath does not leave out of malice. They leave because the environment is no longer viable for their life. A plant that has outgrown its pot must be moved or it will die. The empath has outgrown the container of their old social circle. Returning is not an option because the roots of their new identity cannot fit into the shallow soil of the past. The decision is practical. It is an acknowledgement that the conditions required for their survival are not present in those relationships. This realization brings a profound sense of solitude, but it is a clean solitude. The empath stops waiting for closure from the other people. They realize that closure is not something you get from an external conversation. It is something you create through internal acceptance. They accept that the play is over. The actors have gone home. Standing on the empty stage waiting for applause or an epilogue is pointless. The cutoff is permanent because the empath has stopped abandoning themselves. In the past, every time they went back to a toxic situation, they had to leave a piece of themselves at the door. They had to silence their intuition. They had to swallow their dignity. Now, they have gathered all those pieces back. They are whole. And a whole person does not fit into a broken relationship. The void left behind is not a tragedy. It is simply space. Space where a real life can finally begin. In the final analysis, the empath does not go back because they have nothing to apologize for and nothing to fix. They did not break the relationship. They simply stopped holding it together with their own two hands. They let gravity take its course, and what fell away was never truly theirs to begin with. The journey of the empath who quietly cuts everyone off is not a story of bitterness, failure, or cruelty. It is a story of initiation. It is the arduous, often lonely process of reclaiming the psychic territory that was surrendered in childhood. The silence that disturbs the world is the silence of the self finally taking its seat on the throne of the psyche. It is the end of the negotiation. The empath has realized that they cannot save the world if they are drowning in it. They have realized that the only person they are truly responsible for saving is the one in the mirror. This departure is an act of loyalty, ultimate loyalty to the soul. By refusing to abandon themselves again, they become capable of a new kind of presence. They become sovereign. They are no longer leaves blowing in the wind of other people's emotions. They are the tree, rooted deep in their own earth. They have not cut off the world to punish it. They have simply closed the door to the noise so they can finally hear their own name. And in that silence, they do not find emptiness. They find the person they were always meant to be. If something in you knows the next step is already opening, don't leave this moment unfinished. Click on the next video and keep walking toward the life your unconscious has been trying to return you to.